My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. Welcome from Vancouver, this beautiful land that we have the blessing to call home, from which we acknowledge that Regent College sits in the traditional and ceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation people. We have another very interesting lecture tonight, one of the many events and lectures and resources that we have here at Regent for you. If you are already subscribed for email updates, you know how relevant it is to be up to date and to know everything that is happening continually here at Regent. But if you are not subscribed, I would like to invite you to do so. And you can do it by grabbing one of these little blue cards that are all the way back by the donations box. And when you do that, you can follow the link on the blue side, and in that way you can register digitally on your own. And the other option is to flip it around, and here you can enter your name, your email address, and we will register you from our end here at Regent. Either way, this is the best way to be in the know of what is happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, if it buzzes, rings, or dings, this is the time for you to put it on silent mode, as we will not like to be disrupting our lecture tonight. And lastly, for all of you who are here with us in person, we would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and live streamed under the conditions spelled out by the public notice posted on the door here of Chapel and also the doors of Regent. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Jeff Greenman. He is our president here at Regent and professor of theology and ethics. He will be our host tonight.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Let's give Pablo a hand. He's here for every one of these, and he's essential to all of this. So I'm Jeff Greenman. I'll be your host. Good to see you. Many of you are familiar faces that have been to lots of evening public lectures. But if you're new, let me tell you how tonight is going to operate. So in just a minute, I'll introduce our speaker, but what she will do is speak to us for 45 or so minutes, and then it's time for you folk to ask questions. So be thinking of questions as she addresses us, and there's microphones at the top of the stairs on each side, and if you have a question, pop up there and ask away, and we'll have a good conversation. For those of you who are joining us on the live stream, hello to you around the world and in whatever time zone you may be. You're welcome also to share your questions with us, and you can just email them in questions@regent-college.edu. And Pablo will field those and can bring those forward, so please feel free to join the conversation. So after our time of discussion back and forth with your questions, our speaker will be signing books out at the bookstore. The bookstore is open. There are some of her books there, but there's also other ones from other summer school faculty in particular out on a special table, and the bookstore will be open soon to do your Christmas shopping. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Judith Wolfe, who is making her second appearance at summer school, was here a couple of years ago. She is professor of philosophical theology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. How many of you have ever been to St. Andrews in Scotland? Any of you? A few people, a few hands. She has a very interesting history, which I'll only briefly summarize, being born and raised in Vienna, spending a year as a teenager in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which would be something different, and then being an undergraduate in Jerusalem, which would also be quite different, and then graduate degrees at Oxford in England. She is interested in lots of things, the way that theology, philosophy, literature, and art extend and challenge each other, and teaches courses in pretty much all of those areas and the intersection of theology and the arts. She's written books on a wide variety of things. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, C.S. Lewis, 19th, 20th century theology. The most recent book is called The Theological Imagination, which is the title of her talk tonight, and it's the title of the class she's teaching. So there's just one title to keep in your mind. It's The Theological Imagination. Keep it easy, yes. We should have a quiz, and you'll all pass. One thing I wanted to mention, too, that's very cool, and I was just looking at just a little while ago. There's a 12-minute documentary about Judith and her ideas at a website that's simply At the Threshold, all as one word, At the Threshold, no spaces.com. It's a beautiful little film, and I would commend it to you. It's a filmmaker who's trying to take people like Judith, other theologians, and get their ideas out and about. As you folks have come out to hear her tonight, you'll want to have a look at. So, with no further ado, let's welcome Dr. Judith Wolfe.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see some familiar faces. I've been here all week, so I actually stand at this podium for 3 hours a day every morning. It feels like home right now. So it's lovely to see some of you whom I see in the morning also. It's lovely to see many of you whom I've not met before or whom I haven't seen in a long time. So thank you to be here and giving me the chance to talk about my book. A brief word about how I came to write it. As our host was saying, I was trained at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in literature and in philosophy, and then at Oxford, where I also studied theology. And much of my recent work has been an attempt to identify questions that concern all of us, but that we might find difficult to bring to articulation with the tools of just one discipline. This is part of why I was so drawn to eschatology, which is probably my other big subject, and in fact is the subject on which I taught 2 years ago when I was here. It seems to me that the question of the last things, of what comes after death or at the end of history, is one whose pressure we all feel, but which we seldom know how to even start thinking about. And so it seems to me that resources from within theology, philosophy, literary studies, as well as psychology disciplines are required to engage meaningfully with this pressure of eschatology in that case, and indeed, in this case, the imagination. And I'm very happy to say more about that during Q&A. So in this book that I'm talking about tonight, I wanted to engage another big question whose effects I think we always feel, but which it is hard to articulate, let alone address, within any one discipline. The book is about how to imagine the world theologically. And by this, I don't intend to say that theological thought is imaginative, let alone imaginary, any more markedly than any other kind of thought. Instead, I take all our orientation in the world to be, to some extent, imaginative. To live in the world, we have to imagine it. Imagination, as I use the term, is not primarily the capacity to picture absent or fictional things. Rather, it is first and foremost a continuous stream of sense perception, meaningful, by integrating discrete data points into forms or wholes, what the Germans call Gestalt, the power or capacity, according to the OED, by which the mind integrates sensory data in the process of perception. So imagination in its most basic sense is not about absent things, it's not about fictional things. Imagination is about what we do with the sense data in front of us every moment of perception and the integrative power that we bring to our encounter with the world. Ordinary seeing, the ability to organize the sensory field into discrete objects, involves imaginative acts, which are no less active for remaining, for the most part, unnoticed by us. Seeing involves the assimilation of data points to perceptual patterns that we have inherited or acquired, and which we continue to update in response to ongoing experience. These integrative processes are not, for the most part, subject to our conscious inspection. Because they form part of the very act of seeing, they usually occur unconsciously. They can't become an object of seeing because they're part of the process of seeing. Immanuel Kant describes the imagination as a kind of wizard behind the curtain, quote, a hidden art in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover and to have open to our gaze. Other philosophers and psychologists have used different terms to grasp this same phenomenon. Wertheimer's Gestalt theory, Wittgenstein's idea of seeing as, Merleau-Ponty's phenomenologically dense concept of perception, versions of predictive processing, all of those are similar terms as the term imagination as I'm using it. Now, it's important to say that none just mentioned advocates a radically constructivist or relativist view of perception, but rather in the art historian Ernst Gombrich's term, they're talking about the beholder's share. In other words, when you talk about imaginative construction or creative participation being part of the process of perception, you're not necessarily saying that there's nothing out there except what we project onto it. You're saying that the way that we engage what's out there always brings our own imaginative engagement with it. They investigate not so much what objects are in themselves as how phenomena are constituted for us. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, quote, phenomenology is as painstaking as the works of Balzac, Proust, Valéry, or Cézanne, are all famous artists, by reason of the same kind of attentiveness and wonder, the same demand for awareness, will to seize the meaning of the world or of history as that meaning comes into being for us, unquote. Now, what is true of ordinary sense perception, namely that perception requires the integration of initially undifferentiated sensory data into forms, into wholes, is intensified in the perception of created images, of pictures. The ability to see these strokes as a cube, or these shapes as horses, or these lines as a smile, involves active projection and completion. You are completing the image by matching lines and colors whose meaning is not fully determined by their two-dimensional appearance to memories of spatial and of psychological depth, and thus completing the appearance in front of you. These acts of seeing are not guaranteed by either the image or our memories and patterns. They are co-creative and exceed the calculus of correspondence. In other words, whether you are correctly, quote unquote, matching your memory of psychological depth of smiles to these lines on the canvas is never guaranteed by either the canvas or your memory. There's a co-creative aspect going on. But pictures, images, are not the only objects which we can see only by perceiving in them a depth that is not fully contained in their lines and colors. It is not only the mystery of Mona Lisa, but also the mood and character of people around us, which we grasp imaginatively by attending to their faces. On the one hand, faces only make sense at all, to see faces at all, to make sense of them as faces. We have to see them as icky. A face is always expressive of a psychological depth that informs it, but which is not independently visible. On the other hand, as the philosopher Stanley Cavell argued after Wittgenstein, this kind of expressiveness, this immediate expression of a psychological depth through the lines of a face, is mediated, as I've just said, by our own imaginative participation. Call it empathy, or mind reading, or common sense. Often, this act of empathy, mind reading, common sense, imaginative projection is straightforward. We don't notice any active projection at all. This man is sad. This girl is clearly excited. This is my daughter at her first nativity play, people. She is very excited. But it is, in fact, highly complex and sorts of cues, memories, and pattern matching. People high on the autism spectrum disorder often find it difficult or even impossible to read faces in this way. And sometimes psychological depth only comes into view gradually in our memory. I find this picture fascinating. This is a picture of my 3 children when they were young. And when I look at it now, how many years later? 10 years later, I can see in these faces already traits, character traits, dispositions, the protective instinct of Toby here over Miriam, this boy band look of Nathaniel, the defiance of Miriam. All of those things have come out over the years, but they were so small back then that kind of psychological depth has really come out with memory. And this also means, I think, that like our appreciation of artworks, our perception of faces can never fully escape the risk of mis- or overinterpretation. On the contrary, again, this is Cavell after Wittgenstein, such vulnerability to deception or mistake is integral to the ability to see faces at all. We can engage that vulnerability creatively when we appreciate artworks such as the Mona Lisa. The fact that it's difficult that it's a matter of dispute what this smile means is a classic example or expression of the fact that there is always interpretation going on. And in a case like this, we can discuss it, we can fight about it. It's great when you have had a few glasses of wine. Or it can also be a wonderful thing when we're able willingly to suspend our disbelief in the emotions of an actor on stage. We couldn't appreciate actors at all if it weren't for this ability. Or we can feel this vulnerability to deception that we always carry in us to be violated when confronted with feigned emotion or with something that is presented as a human face, but in fact lacks any kind of psychological depth, like a humanoid robot. I think that's why we're so scared of what we call uncanny valley, of things that look that elicit from us all that sort of imaginative projection of psychological depth, only then to buff it by making us realize there's nothing there. Okay, let's get away from this. Let us go a step further. If we cannot see images or faces without imaginatively projecting the spatial and psychological depth that makes sense of them for us, then the same is true in more subtle and intricate ways of our ability imaginatively to grasp actions or even entire lives. Whether we see this moment as an act of bravery or an act of foolishness depends on imaginative projection informed by memories, expectations, myths, values, and fears. And the interesting thing is, of course, that if you don't know the story that this refers to, namely the martyrdom of Maximilian Kolbe, who offered himself up for a family man in a concentration camp, then this picture doesn't even make sense at all. You can't even be said to really see this picture, see what's going on, if you don't bring all of that context to it. We don't overlay these evaluations, these meanings, as belated optional interpretations on a more basic, neutral perception of the act. Rather, we take in an action and divine its meaning or its value, its evaluation, in a single movement. So it's very immediate. Of course, we can describe what we see in neutral terms, a man is bowing on the ground, etc. But to see the situation as involves a grasp of its significance, and this significance is both found and made. As I'll return to later, the best books, films, and TV series are in fact often those that undo a simple or automated seeing of this kind and sustain the ambiguity of a life story. Is this man a protagonist or an antagonist? It depends on how you connect the dots and which dots you pick out in the first place, because you can't ever make sense of all the dots, partly because it's never clear what data points are relevant in the first place. And this brings me to one of the relevant points of this phenomenological exploration of the imagination. So much of contemporary commercial and political culture aims to capture our imagination with a highly particular and often highly slanted vision. Advertisements and political propaganda don't so much argue us into beliefs as condition us into ways of seeing. They condition us to identify the feeling of freedom with a car, or to make a political, or to identify this as an actual political advertisement from the late 20th century, to condition us into identifying, imaginatively seeing a political party as Antichrist or as a demon. And since seeing feels so immediate, so passive, so obvious, I'm only seeing what's there to see, of course anyone who disagrees is crazy, if not outright perverse. This is a climate in which argument has lost most of its power, because argument is merely an elaboration of something more primal, more basic, more immediate, and seemingly incontrovertible, namely what we see. And we can't tolerate those who dispute our very way of seeing, because otherwise, how could we still know how to read the world and how to orient us in it? So I think this is really a lot of what the political climate that we're in, that people are conditioned to see the world in an immediate fashion, in a particular way, where all other seeing is just crazy. And I showed my students this slide, which I love so much, which really illustrates that well. In this climate, we need to find ways of talking about the imaginative element of all perception. of what Kant calls a blind but indispensable function of the soul, without which we would have no cognition at all, but of which we are seldom even conscious. We need to do so precisely because our imaginative involvement in the world is at once inescapable and usually invisible to us. When kind, he means primarily that it is concealed from us, that we do not see its workings, precisely because its workings are what makes us see. This, as I have just suggested, makes us intensely vulnerable to believing ourselves simply to be passively registering what is out there, rather than also construing it. And in some sense, this hiddenness from ourselves is profoundly necessary for us. It's profoundly, it's needed. We orient ourselves in the world by what we see. We need the sense of something found, of solid ground around us, in order to know how to go on. Just as you can only track space in a sort of, or just as you can only track movement in a sort of Euclidean system, we need to know where we are in the world in order to make any decisions about how to move in it. If we were continuously conscious of our own work of construction and projection, we would never feel at home in the world. Just as, if we were continuously conscious of the ways in which language is constructive and ambiguous, we would never go out and say anything, which, to be honest, is why the hyper-self-conscious continental philosophy is so impossible to read. It's true. Only sometimes, in cracks and gaps, does our own imaginative participation in the construal of things become conscious to us. And when it does, a sense of uncanniness, of a crisis of trust in the world. A small crisis, if a leaf that we picked up turns out to be in fact a bug, but a more profound crisis if we are no longer able to trust our ability to read the behavior of those around us, as Shakespeare's Othello and Leontes find to their doom and to that of their wives, or if we realize that we might have imagined our very worldview. Have I just imagined this? Is one of the most terrifying questions that we can ask. What we need to notice here is that we usually manage these crises when they occur by immediately reasserting the contrast between fact and fiction. I was deluded and the actual fact of the matter is different. But this is not sufficient because in doing so, we immediately mask our own imaginative work again. My book therefore traces some of the workings of this dynamic of what I call, for simplicity's sake, finding and making in different domains of life. Engagement with material objects, engagement with other people, and also engagement with God. In each case, I trace the ways in which what is given is often underdetermined and the characteristic ways that our imagination fills in the gaps for us. And I'm ultimately making a simple argument. On the one hand, our imagination is as indispensable to us as our reason. It's not something optional, it's not something we can deal with. On the other hand, I mean, it's a good part of being human. On the other hand, the imagination distorts precisely by masking its own work. Precisely the imagination's characteristic covering up of gaps, of inconsistencies, of ambiguities, makes it both useful and dangerous. What we need, therefore, is to hold our own seeing more loosely. This is why the book spends a good amount of time on art. One of the key arguments of the book, which is a philosophical argument, though it can only be made by careful attention to art, is that the habituated, automated process of imagining, of seeing the world, is disrupted in experiences with art. It is not a byproduct of artistic creation to elicit the beholder's imaginative participation, but actually one of the core aims of artistic creation. By reducing context and by juxtaposing incongruent materials, artists invite their viewers and readers to construct new or unusual wholes or gestalts or images. These new wholes, these new visions, offer something that we could call a second lens or a descant or an echo on or over the ordinary world. Rather than forcing the world into a particular pattern, they enable an imaginative double or depth vision of the world. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, quote, rather than seeing the painting, I see according to or with it. I see the world with this sort of thing next to it, overlaid, as a depth vision, or in Michael Polanyi's words, quote, "The factual information content of art is slight, its main purpose being to evoke our participation in its utterance," unquote. The history of modern painting can, in part, be told as a history of the changing directions of this artistic purpose. Impressionism, flourishing in the second half of the 19th century, tried to capture the visual experience of a scene in all its dynamism and ephemerality by enlisting the beholder's participation in the act of seeing. By avoiding familiar schematisms, Impressionist paintings remind us that if we did not already know that these were horses or these were lilies, we would not see them as such. The remarkable vitality of these paintings comes from a creative collaboration between the artist's detailed, precise, particular observation and the beholder's imagination, the living dynamism of our imaginative impression of a gestalt on a riot of colors. Expressionism, flourishing in the first half of the 20th century, radicalized this dynamic and this cooperation. No longer cooperation at this point, you'll see, where Impressionism still aimed for a collaboration between an unstructured sense impression and a schema or gestalt or pattern that we see, that we overlay on it. Expressionism deliberately set the two at odds with each other. The elements of an expressionist painting integrated straightforwardly into a form or a whole such as we might encounter in the real world. They gesture in that direction, but they do not allow the beholder to complete the gesture. Where in space is Kokoschka's still life with mutton and hyacinth arranged? How do the elements of Picasso's still life relate to themselves, to each other, and to the space that they are supposedly in? These paintings bring to consciousness the perpetual and usually unconscious endeavor to read or see elements according to a whole, according to a unified space, precisely by frustrating that endeavor. Sometimes, as in Picasso's Weeping Woman here, incoherence on the sensory level can be resolved into sense on a semantic or figurative level. This woman appears broken because she is broken on the inside. There's something expressive, hence the term expressionism. There's something expressive of an interior brokenness in the broken lines on the canvas. Her pictorial disjointedness is not incidental, but precisely expressionistic. Similarly, Salvador Dali's phantasmagorical shapes are expressive of something, of the sometimes threatening uncanniness of the world that we encounter with our senses. Modern and postmodern art, flourishing in the second half of the 20th century and on into our own, explored endless variations of this ability to create a conflict between immediate sensory data on the one hand and imaginatively projected patterns, forms, or meaningful wholes on the other, aimed not at a single effect, but at a deliberate multiplicity of responses. Ready-mades remove everyday objects from the contexts within which they ordinarily make sense, and create a jarring interpretative context through titling and spatial positioning. Take an everyday object out of its everyday context, and suddenly you're creating a real dissonance. Indeterminate art, abstract art, stimulate the beholder's attempt to see form or meaning, only to frustrate that attempt on the pictorial level. The effect of this interruption of the interpretative process is purposely left to the viewer. Some feel excited at a seeming endlessness of possibilities. Some are frustrated by the thwarting of their interpretative faculty. Some feel bored because there's nothing to be seen here. Some are moved to reflect on the process of the encounter that it triggers in them, and some simply relax because there's no goal-directed activity necessary. Responses. In all these cases, the anxiety of interpretation that's common to all art interpretation, am I just making this interpretation up, is not neutralized, but deliberately sustained. In all these cases, good art does not try to make the world more complete, more pretty, more simple and understandable than it in fact is, but rather they try to metabolize what is dark, what is scary, what is unsettling, to help the viewer confront it. Experiences with art are akin to religious experience. Theology and religion are often seen as paradigm cases of imposing illusory patterns on the world or on people, of pretending to find truths where they are merely imagining things, and of insisting to these supposed truths, whether or not this does violence to them. But I think, in fact, the opposite is the case. For the Christian faith, the human imagination is in important ways adequate to the nature of reality, because our world is poetic, both in the sense that it is God's work or craft, and in the sense that we don't merely apprehend, but also co-create, make it. Christian faith manifests itself, among other things, as a way of seeing the ordinary world, which invests that world, imaginatively or inspiredly, with an unseen depth of divine intention and spiritual significance. It brings to things in general, to the ordinary world at large, some of the attitudes that people ordinarily bring to works of art, an expectation that there is something here to be found, a willingness to participate in its utterance. At the same time, Christian faith also suggests that the human imagination always remains inadequate to God and the world. God himself, of course, exceeds our imagining. But even the ordinary world, even other people and we ourselves, have depths and complexities that remain hidden and seen. To believe in God demands a commitment to not reducing the complexity of the data points before us, even if that comes at the cost of not being able to make full sense of the world. Such commitment rests on trust that beyond any order that we can impose on the world imaginatively will be held together by God. And so the final chapters of the book are concerned with this dialectic of cataphasis and apophasis, and explore ways in which art, literature, and music can help us to sustain it. So in the last part of this talk, I want to unpack this a little, taking as my starting point the incongruences that expressionist and contemporary art draws to our attention. This speaks to an aspect of faith which is, I think, very but often overlooked. I have talked before, and also in other contexts, of the ways in which biblical stories seek to engender gestalt shifts, aspect shifts, to allow both the characters in the stories, think of Jonah or Job or Martha or Thomas or Peter or Paul, and also us as readers, to see Jesus, not her, to see Jesus in the poor and the stranger. But the new ways of seeing that the Bible gives are not just static things that are already there, unseen. They are ways of seeing into the future, into what is not yet, but what we are called to help, to shape and bring into being. In other words, the stranger may not yet be Christ. He becomes Christ through our own loving service to some extent. Christ is revealed in him. There is something that we active to the realization of the unseen depths that we are called to see. Consider that a metaphor comes alive at the very center of our faith. There is, if you wish, the incarnation itself, which C.S. Lewis aptly calls a myth made fact. But there is also the body of Christ more widely. The painter David Jones said that it would be unthinkable, quote, the redemption of the world, anything should have been done which committed man to any activity not utterly inalienable from his nature. In such a context, the extraneous is inconceivable, unquote. And therefore the Lord's choice on the night before he was betrayed, as one of his last acts on earth, to take bread and wine and declare them his body and blood, was not an artificial illustration of the work ahead or a mechanical mechanism for its transmission. Rather, it named and transformed a mystery that lies near the heart of human existence. The Last Supper made into fact what can usually exist only as a poetic invention. In identifying bread and wine with body and blood, it is what we might call a literal metaphor, carrying something over from one form of reality to another, of seeing one thing as another, which in imagining truly finds. This carrying over, or metaphora, remains, I think, a continual task of faith and of theology. Much of the Christian faith is centered on metaphors whose truth is both found and made, real beyond our imagining, and yet ours to make. The body of Christ is perhaps the most striking example of this. While in some sense, Eucharist and after an earthly sojourn at the Father's right hand, it is also a designation of the church. The body of Christ is the church, whose shape will not be known fully until the eschaton. This body is itself constituted through the Eucharistic liturgy, and the dynamic interrelation between the Eucharist and the Church as the body of Christ reveals a complexity, seriousness, and depth of imaginative exchange that leads any engagement with ordinary art. One vital dimension of this exchange is the experience of time which it reveals and enables, and the commerce, the interaction between event, ordinary life, the past, the future, and our ultimate horizons. The Eucharistic liturgy understands itself as a living image of the eschatological wedding feast of the Lamb, in which worshippers are enabled to participate proleptically in body, spirit, and imagination. It puts us imaginatively the Lamb that we hope for. This spiritual participation is not merely anticipatory. It's not merely something that we're imagining ourselves into proleptically, but is itself formative. The very act of worship helps to transform the worshipper into the body and bride who will one day sit at that wedding feast of the new creation. This alchemy, if you will, requires that worshippers identify with the body of Christ in a way that's not a form of hubris or arrogation, but a confession, to confess that we are internally broken and need both to receive and to be taken into Christ's body. This is what happens at the Eucharist. As Martin Luther puts it, quote, when the body eats it physically, this food digests the body's flesh and transforms spiritual, unquote. But it is equally significant to this existential exchange, if you will, that the Mass takes its name not from its consummation, not from its high point, but from its dissolution, from its end point. Ite missa est, go, ascending has taken place. To grow into the body of Christ, worshippers cannot remain at the worship service and do likewise. They must return to their ordinary lives in the light of this event. And this leads me to one last thing to say, which returns to the beginning of this lecture and also points us forward as soon as I've taken a sip of water. We make and we follow metaphors. We search for spiritual depth, and world show themselves to us as incomplete within their own dimensions, and therefore as indicative of more than meets the eye. In other words, if we cannot make sense of the world on a simple, immanent level, it suggests that we must have to make sense of it on a deeper spiritual level. If this is the case, then one way of suggesting that we, others, and the world have unseen depth, pointing out things that remain incomplete or incoherent within a merely material or even a merely psychological or sociological context. This is a basic impetus of both art and religion. It is one dimension of Rowan Williams's observation that the reality that we encounter is obscurely incomplete, as he says, that it, quote, proposes to the poet the task of making not mean imposing upon it an alien structure of explanation, unquote. Williams, along with somebody like Jacques Maritain, notes an incompleteness to our merely physical experience of the world, which both art and faith register and respond to faithfully and creatively. However, returning to our opening, this unseen depth of the world is mediated to us by our imagination and by our desire, which are fallible. This is as true of the interpretation of art, which is perpetually fraught with the anxiety of over or misinterpretation, as it is of the experience of the divine. In striving to perceive God, we cannot cancel or circumvent the burden of interpretative responsibility and its endemic risk of error, even though we have the counsel and the help of the Holy Spirit. We can do this neither by relying, as Planting Divinitatis attempts, on a special mechanism which is insulated against the vagaries of the imagination, nor by relying simply on the experience of what Jean-Luc Mario calls saturated phenomena that overwhelm us from the outside and overwhelm our own intentional movements. Such experiences of overwhelm, of simple reception, do certainly occur. The Holy Spirit does speak to us immediately, but they must nevertheless be assimilated into everyday life through conscious self-interpretation. And because experience of the divine in our own selves and the world relies on imaginative investment, it is impossible categorically or conclusively and absolutely to avoid its over- or misinterpretation. Perceptions of God, even for those who firmly believe in the divine as I do, is always vulnerable to over-narration, to disconfirmation. Think of the disillusioned charismatic bitterly reporting that what I thought was a spiritual experience was really narration, and to repeated re-narration. Think of anyone who has experienced a failed vocation or a failed relationship and has to re-narrate their lives. It's not necessarily the case that they were deluded then and are right now, are correct now. It might be that they were correct then and are deluded now, but there is certainly a sense that we cannot fully and simply rely on the way that we are interpreting experience. And this raises with painful force, I think, the question of what it is that spiritual vision sees. On the one hand, it takes the form of an enriched depth perception, an apprehension of a depth of intention, significance, beauty, and love in and among ordinary things. All those things are true forms of seeing. These forms of awareness are mediated by a trained imagination and by trained desire, and it's so important that in our churches and in our education we train the imagination and the desire and perception to see the depth of love of God in the world. On the other hand, it may confront us with incompleteness and with disjunction that are not easily resolved at any depth accessible to us, contradictions that drive us beyond any attempt to make sense of life within its own dimensions, and cannot be made coherent even by the depth projection of divine providence. Death, I think, is one of those contradictions, however firmly we believe. A life of faith, I believe, is not merely a way of making sense of the world. It is also a way of acknowledging the nonsensicality of the world, neither to deny nor prematurely to seek to resolve it. Engaging this dimension of faith, in which things don't yet always make sense and cannot yet always be made to cohere, requires a self-abnegating imagination. That is, an imagination that knows itself to be at once necessary and constitutively inadequate. Such imagination is trained on an intentional attention to the things that are odd, to the gaps in human experience that do not and will not make sense. The experience of God, of glory, of art, or of love suggest that our imaginative sense-making is in some sense a prolepsis, a jumping forward, an anticipation of a wholeness that we have glimpsed, but which we cannot yet capture. And this is because the world and we are not yet finished. The human vocation is to be drawn, at the last, into that triune life of God, the love between Father, Son, and Spirit, which defines the divine nature or life, and which overflows into the creation of a non-divine world. However, such deification, this call to theosis, this call to be drawn into the divine life, is not a calling that is attainable by human capacities or fully in this life. It is an eschatological promise. As Paul puts it, quote, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love," unquote. Or the first letter of John, "Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is." This vision calls for a way both of affirmation and of apophasis, of finding, making, and relinquishing. Poetry and art cannot guarantee the fulfillment of our glimpses of wholeness, but they can awaken our courage to hope for it. They can be, in Heidegger's term, formal indications, pointers to a path that can only be walked in ordinary life. Our vocation, as I have said, is to be drawn ever more fully into that love of God which binds in a single volume, as Dante puts it, that which is dispersed in leaves throughout the universe, unquote. If the Christian faith is a way of making sense, it does not do so merely by laying out a metaphysical or doctrinal pattern to which to adjust our perception, although it does do that as well. Rather, it makes sense of the world by enabling us to hold open horizons that we always rush to foreclose, to sustain uncertainty in the light of a divine promise. To realize this capacity, however, requires a deep faith in a God whom we cannot grasp or take full hold of, a God who is not simply available and who does not simply enable the fulfillment of our ambitions, even though he holds out the much greater gift of eternal life. And this engenders, among other things, a self-abnegating theological imagination, a realization both of the adequacy and of the inadequacy of our ways of sense-making to the mystery of creation. Yes, theology constructs. It constructs metaphysical accounts of the world. It constructs theories and images to guide us, but they are light, tentative, humble, because when we construct theologically, we are not building towers. We are building boats, and we trust the sea. Thank you.
So then let's go out to sea.
Let's go out to sea.
All right. That's great. Thank you so much, Judith. So a reminder, so if you have a question to ask, up at the top of the stairs, there's 2 microphones. Come join us. If you're joining us online, questions at regent-college.edu. I've got some questions, but you guys got questions? I know you do. Yeah, come on up. So let me go back to the beginning, if I may, in terms of your definition of the imagination a little bit. So when I think about the kinds of experience that you're talking about, of making sense out of the world, I would think that our minds do it. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have differentiated particularly the imagination's role within that. Yeah. And I'm wondering about the relationship or the distinction, the interplay between imagination and reason, which you haven't talked a lot about, and desire. You also mentioned desire or you maybe emotion. So are all of those at work in this process you're talking about, and how do you see them working together?
So that's a really good question, and in the book I talk about that a little bit because I think one of the dangers of talking about the imagination in that way is that it can reify something which is in fact part of a whole complex processes that involve a lot of different abilities and patterns. So I'm not at all wanting to advocate something like an old-fashioned faculty psychology in which there's the faculty of the will, there's the faculty of desire, there's the faculty of reason, there's the faculty of imagination. I don't think that's how psychology works. And I think that certainly when we talk about what I call the imagination here, this integrative movement or this sense-making movement, all of those things, desires as way of seeing, obviously reason, are all at work together. And so really the term imagination just picks out a process or a moment within our overall experience that helps us when we focus on it this way to bring certain things into focus, but of course it obscures other things. And the question of to what extent does our rational mind, what comes into the rational mind, into reason, what kinds of thought processes, how does that enter our emotional pressure, etc. All of those questions kind of move out of focus when we move other things into focus, but that's just That's just a product of any kind of investigation, that you train your lens on something and other things become blurry.
And the biblical idiom talks a lot about the heart, right? As sort of the core of who we are.
Yeah.
And so you would see with the heart in biblical language. Does that make sense and consistent with what you're talking about? Philip.
I think one of the things that emphasizes is precisely that we bring our person into the process of seeing. That it's not merely a matter of sort of things going into
mechanics,
our heads
yes.
and taking up residence
Right.
there.
Right.
It is an interactive process. So I think in that sense, yes,
Right.
They work together.
Right. Great. Thanks. Let's go up to this side. You're so polite. This is very Canadian. Who goes first? Okay, let's go over here to the top. Over here, yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to speak a little bit about how Jesus used the theological imagination, engaged his people with it in use of parables, and how he taught?
Sure, I would love to talk about that. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think, and we talked about this in class, it is striking that so much takes the form of parables. And I think we have to take seriously that choice of our Lord's to teach in that way rather than by lists or injunctions. And the risk that he was taking of interpretation, because people, if he had wanted to make sure that not to elicit our imaginative engagement, he wouldn't have used that form. And so that's just something interesting to reflect on. And I think a lot of what the work that the parables do is precisely this kind of aspect shift or gestalt shift. They seek to make us see things in new ways. And I think that that's actually true also of his non-parabolic teaching in many instances. Obviously, the parable of the sheep and the lambs is a parable, but also something a little bit more direct. But this sort of the wish to make us see anew and see him in the people around us is really a radical example of engendering a gestalt shift, making us see the world anew, and then being true to all that brings with it. But I think even something like the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes and the radical injunctions to turn the other cheek or give the tunic and the shirt or go the extra mile, in a way that's a way of making us see the world anew, a world in which those are blessed who would not ordinarily be seen as blessed, and therefore also calling us to try to figure out on what level that can make sense. What must the world be like for that to be the true way of seeing it? And so I think so much of the New Testament ethic, if you will, or of one aspect of the ethic enjoined by the New Testament, is to see the world as having so much abundance of divine love and plenitude that we can freely fling away our property, that we can freely fling away even our lives, because we have no need of hoarding, we have no need of protecting ourselves, because we live out of this unseen abundance of God's provision and love, which of course is also illustrated or made real in all the miracles of Christ, particularly in the Gospel of John. Every single miracle or sign in the Gospel of John is a turning of scarcity into abundance, a turning of sickness into health, a turning of death into life. And so Jesus kind of shows forth by his very actions a new way of seeing the world, a sort of abundance and goodness that we might not be able to see with our physical eyes, but which we are called to see with our spiritual eyes, so that we can respond to the world in a new way.
And can I just follow up on that? How do people learn to see like that?
Well, to some extent we have to teach them in the church by making them feel in their bones that the world is like that. And I think certainly that comes particularly from being loved. If we are shown an abundance of love and care by those around us, then we might grow secure in a sense of God's love and care, so that we can then go out and pass it on to others. But in the absence of human mediation of that kind of certainty or knowledge, a lot of prayer, guess. But I do think that as Christians particularly, to show forth and to pass on that vision of the world in very practical terms.
Beautiful. Thank you. Let's go over to this side. Yep, thanks.
Thank you, Professor. I guess my question is, would you say that the imagination is condemned to perpetual reinterpretation?
Do you want to elaborate a bit more?
I'm thinking, because you were speaking of the eschaton, and that plays into a lot of your work, and the finalization of things in the eschaton means that at present a sort of judgment needs to be withheld. So what impact does that have on my imagination? Will I have any certainty, or, I mean, you spoke a little bit about that, but I think I mean it a little differently. How can I exist in my own imagination when it's, so to speak?
That's a really, really good question. And I think there are multiple ways of answering it. I think that to some extent, yes, the imagination is always open to revision. The way that we see and interpret the world is constantly open to revision. And in fact, we do constantly revise our imagination. We just usually forget about it. You know, we don't notice that yesterday we saw something quite differently than we do today, because how we see it now just kind of, overlays that. But I think particularly in our interactions with other people, we are constantly updating how we interpret what they're doing or the story that we are part of. And that in many ways, the more people we encounter, or the more we know of the world, the more data points there are to integrate. And so the overall whole or form does just subtly shift all the time. And I do think that that's just an inalienable part of human experience and human existence. I don't think that necessarily means that I do think that we have to act on our best knowledge at any one point. The only way to make progress or to develop is to act on our best knowledge at any one point, but also to be open to revise when new evidence comes into view. I also do think that that's part of this dynamic is part of the reason why many people choose to be in liturgical churches, where there is a sort of a set form that has, in some sense, stood the test of time, in a sense, regardless of how we interpret it. So there's a sense of a structure that one can pour oneself into, and that doesn't rely on our particular perception on any one day. I think the sort of the fatigue of, of making sense can often set in when we are wholly responsible for what we do in worship at any one week. I think that is one of the big draws of more permanent structures. But yeah, so I think it's not that we need to be anxious about this. It's just that we need to sit somewhat lightly, even to our uncertainties.
Good, thank you. Another question over here. Hi, Kathy.
Hi. First off, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I'm trying hard to pull some threads together. It may feel a little left field, but because of your interest in kind of multiple disciplines overlapping, you've spoken to this deep need for the training of the imagination, kind of the discipling of the imagination in these faculties, and the inherently sort of embodied phenomenological aspect of that we actually don't do this as a faculty just of reason, but we're making sense of data points, and it's anyone with small children can see how this is slowly happening over time.
Yeah.
I think in the field of education, parenting, discipleship right now, in this cultural moment, we're confronted with the influx of AI technology, overwhelming takeover. And I think it's impossible for us to completely avoid them. And I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on whether whether these technologies that people describe as generative, I'll say algorithmically generative, do these have potential for being fruitful tools for us in these endeavors, or are they inherently, shall we say, cancel and circumvent the burden of interpretive labor for us? What do you think are the dangers? What in this moment do we need to resist and be careful of when we're thinking of discipling one another and young people? And do you think, though, that there are any possibilities to see this as, like other media throughout history that have been new and sometimes scary at first, is there potential for this to enhance or flow in?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. We talked about that a little bit in class the other day, and I have a feeling that we're going to continue to talk about it because, it's probably the most important thing to happen in our time in some respect. I mean, the world will never be the same. And so we have to confront it. And of course, like any moment in time that brings such radical change, there is both danger and promise. There's no, it's not either one or the other. But it does seem to me that that because there is no center of consciousness in the generative output of AI, there's a mode of discernment that's absent in the in what is in the information that is generated, and there's a sense in which the output of AI relies on input from generations, from centuries of human creativity, of human imagination, which are harvested and then put out in conformity with patterns or algorithms that are not actually human, that have a dynamic of their own. And so going into the future, if AI continues to learn, the kinds of creativity which we see are in some sense an inhuman kind of creativity, because generated according to principles that aren't actually like the imaginative and creative principles that we bring to our perception. And so I think it's even more important, and I'm thinking about this as an educator, obviously, that for so many generations, part of the most important work that a scholar had to learn was how to find information, right? And you could spend weeks traveling to an archive, finding the microfiche, deciphering it, which you can do now in the course of seconds, because everything is digitized, and you can just press the find function where you had to scroll through hundreds of manuscript pages to find something. So the kind of work that for many centuries we trained our students to do is no longer actually the work that a scholar needs to do. But what is necessary now is a profound work of discernment, of being confronted by this endless stream of output, frictionless output, which we alone can sift and discern and engage with and discern the meaning of or make meaningful for us. And so one of the many things that I'm thinking about as an educator is how do we now move to train our students in that very different form of scholarly aptitude, for which we don't really have the mechanisms of teaching or assessing yet, but which will, I think, be something that humans just have to very consciously be trained how to do in the future.
Thanks very much. Question up here.
Over quite some time, as I'm sure we're all aware, our society has slowly developed a hyper-focus in some ways on rationality to the exclusion of imagination. But rather than excluding entirely, it has simply split the two into fields that don't play nicely with each other. That's obviously a result of philosophical dialogues outside of the church, but they influence the church as well, and our perceptions of reality. Are there particular ways that you perceive that those currently disparate fields can brought into light again, particularly in the church, but our society as a whole, to reinvigorate each other, not as two separate parallel modes of thinking, but rather as components of each other. And obviously the classical example, maybe not classical, but classic example of our time is science and the arts, but that expands far beyond just that scope as well.
That's a big question. I'll only say one thing about it maybe, which is that, and we talked about that in class as well, that to some extent rational argument only carries as much conviction as we buy into the plausibility of the premises and of the argument. So in other words, what comes first, in a sense, is a much more basic perception, which I think is imaginatively mediated, a more basic perception of what the world is like, what we can expect to be able to make sense of in the first place, what can count as an answer, what we can bear, what we can live with, what kind of trade-offs we're willing to make, etc., etc. And it's really only on the basis of that an argument can seem plausible, can gain plausibility, which is why different philosophies appeal to different people, almost, prior to or underneath the cogency of their arguments. So I think that very often when people think that they're not making good enough arguments for the faith, for example, it's not actually about the arguments at all. It's about the antecedent plausibility in the perception of people of what kinds of things the world could be thought of as containing. And so that's why, and we were talking, that's why sort of imaginative expansion, such as we find in the works of C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, which just put us in the shoes or put us in a position in which the world opens up and certain things become thinkable, certain things become imaginable, are in a sense necessary or prior to the work of argumentation. So I think that the two, are intricately related and intrinsically related. We're just not always conscious of the ways in which they are, and we should be more conscious of that as a church.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Question up here.
Good evening. One of the problems I have is determining whether what seems to be a message to me is a divine message through the Holy Spirit, or whether it's the product of my imagination. And I think you said that there was an integration there, and that the Holy Spirit had to move one's imagination for it to be transformative. But I'm wondering if you have any tips.
I'm not a pastor. There are pastors in the room.
But I'm sure you've thought about this, and goosebumps really are not quite enough, right. and perhaps you've right. got some thoughts on that.
Unfortunately, I have too few thoughts on this, and it's something that I wish I had more clarity on. Having grown up in a charismatic environment, that's such a big question, this question of discernment. And I'm not sure that I've come to any sort of conclusive criteria. I do think that there are a lot of criteria that we can employ to test an experience. Certainly conformity with scripture, conformity with doctrine, conformity with the sort of sensus fidelius of the community, where it's important to check our experiences and intuitions against the wise counsel of others who have experience. So I think that kind of sifting work, that kind of work of discernment is always ongoing, and we can see many examples in history of mystics, of contemplative people who've done exactly that kind of work of discernment. But I think even that is not necessarily conclusive. I don't think that it's ultimately possible always thoroughly and absolutely to distinguish between something that is pure inspiration and something that is a work of the imagination, and that's part of the risks of faith. It is. So that's as far as I've gotten.
And what would you say to the people here tonight who might be thinking with your emphasis on, in a sense, our role, our part in this process of interpretation and imagining, that we run the risk of just too much relativism here? Mm-hmm. There's not enough emphasis on the there-ness of there, mm-hmm. and so much on us. Doesn't that just make you kind of nervous? What would you say to that?
No, that's a really good question, and I've been emphasizing that every day in class. Although I'm, I'll always have to emphasize it again. I think that the work that I'm doing here and the kinds of things that I'm emphasizing here are one part of a larger conversation. It's only one conversation partner in the room. There has to be the other conversation partner of a deep realism about the world, about God. So really, I'm not making any judgment about the reality of God or of the world. I'm really only emphasizing what we bring to that encounter, right. And that there are just simply certain forms of leaping of creativity that are part of our encounter with things, but that doesn't reduce, that doesn't end up as a mere relativism, because if everything were actually relative, then there wouldn't be any real risks involved at all, right? I mean, then it would just be a matter of who has more power to impose their vision on others. And of course, that is exactly how the world often works, that people think that the world is so malleable, so fluid, so relative, that whoever has power can impose their vision on everybody around them. And we certainly have to withstand that. But that's part of why I'm emphasizing that there is risk involved in our imaginative encounter with the world. It's risk precisely because the imagination is not all there is.
And we have a question from John.
I think this is wonderful, and I'll try never to say, if I'm with someone who misperceived something, I'll never again say, it was just your imagination, because it's sort of given, right?
Right.
It's always imagination. I'm afraid I have a couple of more AI questions.
Oh, no.
And they're sort of building on what was already asked, and there are two. You can answer only one if you want, but I think they're related. So the first is getting back to the Kantian definition of imagination, and the definition you employ.
Yeah.
I could see an AI optimist saying, well, we're getting there, or maybe we're already there. You look at an AI bot looks at what you and I know as the Mona Lisa. It's doing pattern recognition. So the engineers would, but I'm pretty sure that's not what you mean. So I wonder if the language of imagination gives us a way to say why an AI bot will never be human, or if not, if we need to look somewhere else for that answer. Because my intuition, I assume yours, is that they're never going to be human, superhuman, any kind of human. Is that category of imagination helpful or not? Do we need to look elsewhere? The second question, depending on how you answer that, the second question might be very easy to answer. And it's that I was struck at your the yieldings of AI, those images, they're hideous in a way, but what is wrong with them from your perspective? That they're artificial, but in a sense, all this is artifice, right? Artifice. So what's the super artificiality of the products of AI that I think you rightly viscerally reacted to? I share the same reaction, but this is another thing I struggle to put it to language, but I'm hoping maybe you can help. Thanks.
So I'll try to answer the second one actually, because it's in some way it's easier to take hold of than the first one. So I think that what I was saying near the beginning of the lecture was that we often make sense of images by seeing in them a depth that is not literally there on the two-dimensional canvas. but without which the image doesn't make sense as an image. And similarly, we see faces as disclosive of an emotional or psychological depth, a depth of soul, if you will, which is not immediately present, which is not seeable, but which alone makes sense of that which we see. And so one of the really uncanny, scary things, it seems to me, unsettling things about AI production, whether of language or of images, is that we're confronted with something that calls forth our imaginative participation, that calls us to see, to project a depth, which in fact is not there, because it is mindless output in a sense. And that's the case with images, and why some people react strongly to images, even if they can see the same image. If you tell them that it's human generated, it's a beautiful image. If you tell them that it's AI generated, it suddenly becomes revulsive in some sense. And that's precisely because you feel fooled in your imaginative projection of a psychological or emotional depth. And I think one of the really scary things that happens, to me at least, is that when I read too much AI-generated texts, I then go back to human-written texts, and I have this uncanny feeling that maybe this too is AI-generated somehow. And so I come to distrust the human depth, even of human communication. And I think that that's really insidious. But that's one of the sort of almost hidden insidious dangers of AI infecting our perception of the world more generally, that it makes us suspicious of any of our imaginative participation in what we encounter. So yes, in that sense, imagination, I think, is an important concept for thinking about AI.
Well, you have a question from someone on the live stream.
That is correct. Yes, we do have 2 online questions. They are not AI. And the first question is from Christine. He asks, can you give examples of how one might train the imaginations and desires of children who are your children's ages? I am a Regent grad who is now homeschooling my 3 kids.
Read them stories. I mean, really, no, I mean that seriously. I mean, reading stories to children just seems to me such an important part of their education. And in fact, many of my happiest childhood memories are of being read stories. And you can't, those provide so much texture and depth to one's engagement with the world later. And you can't even survey or predict that, but just giving children the material, the texture to draw on, in times of crisis, in times of dearth, is really irreplaceable, I think, and that is the right age at which to do it.
Thank you. I have another question, and this question asks, is it true, and if so, can you speak to ways that Western culture undermines and underplays the role of imagination, and how that contrasts to other cultures that may be more open to the role of imagination in interpretations, particularly in contrast to the Hebrew culture? How would you suggest in Western culture overcome this underplay of imagination?
Oh my gosh, that's a difficult question. I have never been thoroughly enough immersed in a completely different culture to be able to answer that question comparatively. Modern day Israel is really not close enough to a more classical Hebrew culture to really form a good basis of comparison here. I think that Western culture doesn't necessarily underplay the imagination so much as to capture it. So I think that what much of, and I talked about this a little bit, of course, in the lecture, much of what popular culture tries to do is to gain the high ground of imaginative capture, to make us think that there is only one way of seeing the world, whereas in fact that way might be completely different from how we might have seen the world even 10 years ago. I mean, if you think about whatever you may think of the gender debates, the fact that nowadays most people will intuitively think that certain gender expression normal or to be celebrated, the fact that that's the case now, where even 15 years ago, aesthetically speaking, in terms of perception, it would have been radically different, is a matter not so much of arguments winning, as of the imagination being captured by the portrayal of certain things in popular media, by the sort of the making us re-see things. So I think that kind of battle for our imaginative perception of the world, that battle is ongoing all the time, both in politics and in entertainment, and of course in commercial contexts.
Great, thank you. Let's go up here.
Hi, Dr. Wolfe. Thanks for your lecture. Amazing. I also read your book for a class last term and thoroughly enjoyed it, so thank you. My question is back to the sort of back to the question of the relative or real world. And personally, I find the encouragement for a sort of flexible vision to be like quite like encouraging. Like I really like that. So it's not so scary to me to think that there could be some like shifting happening in our imaginations and our perceptions of things. But I also find myself, like, as often as I'm pursuing that kind of direction, coming up against places where I want to be able to hold a vision tight-fisted and not budge on it and be grounded in it and know with certainty that that's not something that's not a vision that I have to be willing to have reformed. And so it seems like the open-handed kind of visions are the ones that involve our imaginative act, maybe. And so I'm wondering if there's a way in which God's agency is the one that informs our imagination or our vision or something, so that it can be held tightly or closed-fisted. Or if you can just kind of talk about, like, how does the reality of the world that doesn't shift, or the pattern of the world created and stays, how does that enter our imagination in a way that's like trustworthy and meaningful and sustained, I guess?
That's a good question. I think it is part of Christian faith that we see certain things as bigger than us, as things that we can hold on to and things that we can allow to shape our imagination of the world. And that's just part and parcel of what it is to be a Christian. And so the creeds, they've been passed on to us for 2 millennia. They are trustworthy. And our sort of what we see in accordance with them can shift a little bit, can change, but I think that it's our right, in a sense, as Christians, to rely on certain things, and to, as I say, to let our imagination be shifted, be changed by that, rather than being always in flux. And I also think that that one has to take seriously what contemplative people involved in contemplative prayer, what they witness to, which is a sense that there is, that if we know anything at all, we know ourselves as held by the love of God. That our knowledge of ourselves and of the world doesn't go any deeper than the conviction that God has loved us into being and that God holds the world in love. If that is not true, then none of our knowledge about ourselves is true. I think that's a firm conviction that's especially for people who engage in contemplative prayer, which kind of puts everything else together. And so in a sense, everything else can fall apart. Our perception can fall apart. We can be in a complete crisis of making sense of the world. But there's something underneath all of that that nevertheless carries us. And I think that is something that we can trust in.
Thank you.
I'll ask one last question before we wrap up. Looking out at the audience, I see 4 people that I know, and there might be other ones out there as well, who are really good visual and very, very thoughtful about it and very talented. On the basis of the Christian imagination and the theological imagination you're talking about, what would you say to them as artists about what they're doing?
I don't know. They have to tell me what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I do think, one of the things that many artists who are also Christians are rightly frustrated with is that much of what calls itself Christian art is really in some sense kitsch, because it tries to make the world...
She came right out and said it.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much.
Because it tries to simplify and make the world prettier and safer than it actually is. Whereas I think, what an artist can have the courage to do is to confront the world in all its messiness, in everything that we actually encounter and experience, out of a deep trust that God holds it together. And so we don't have to artificially hold it together. We don't have to make premature sense of it because of faith and trust in God. And so a sort of freedom or courage to engage the world in all its complexity is, I think, something that Christian artists can have the ability to do, informed by their faith and not in contrast to their faith.
Beautiful answer, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Let's thank Judith for a really wonderful evening. Let me just make a couple of little announcements as we go, and then in just a minute, Judith will be at the bookstore to sign books. Every author loves to sign copies of their books. And don't you? Of course you do. All authors do. She'll be there in just a minute. So thank you for coming. Thank you for these really great questions and a really lovely conversation that we've had. These lectures are made possible with the generosity of many people who are Regent donors. If you are so inclined, there is a donation box as you go out the way. If you want to put some money in there, that's great. If you wanted to make a donation online to us as a token of appreciation for tonight, that would be online at rgnt.net/give. The recording of tonight's lecture will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. That's just the Regent College channel on the youtube.com. And those recordings from the summer lectures will be there until August 31st. So if you wanted to point someone else in the direction of what you've heard tonight, that would be the place to direct them as well. We're taking a bit of a pause in summer school now to regroup a bit, and then we will resume in July, which is coming very soon. The next evening public lecture is July 2nd with Sarah Williams, speaking about her new book on Josephine Butler, the amazing British social reformer. And then John Owen is here and asked about AI. John Owen is teaching in summer school on faith and politics. Yeah, that's a good subject these days. Yeah, thumbs up. And he's doing the evening public lecture on July 7th, so that's some advanced billing. If you're still interested in registering for summer school courses, those are available and you can still sign up if you are interested. Okay? Those are your public service announcements. Thanks for being with us and have a lovely evening. Good night.